What's up, average engineers? Today I want to talk about AWS Lambdas. Why AWS Lambdas? Mostly because I feel like in the data engineering space they're ignored and not used, and I just find a lot of data engineers don't have any experience with them, don't know what they would use them for or how kind of they work, or get an overview of them. They don't really have a good overview. So yeah, I think that's what I'm going to talk about today, is just at a high level, AWS Lambdas, what you'd use them for in a data engineering context, and maybe show a quick example of how you could make one and how you could basically manage it and code and what it looks like to deploy a Lambda, things like that, just to give you a high level overview of what to expect if you've never really worked with them before. I would say it can be helpful just to see like a real world context of making a Lambda, deploying a Lambda, kind of just what that looks like in the real world. Okay, for data engineers, what is an AWS Lambda? Basically, it's a serverless thing, right? Or you hear talk about serverless, especially the last few years. And what made AWS Lambdas popular is they're serverless. They are basically bits of code that you write that'll run anytime, anywhere, very scalable. They're just meant to be small, quick things. One thing that's important for data engineers to know is that Lambdas have a 15-minute max runtime, so they can only run for 15 minutes max, which tells you, they are made to be sort of a short-lived thing. They also have a 10 gigabyte memory max, which is important to know as well. That's what they max out. You can't get any bigger than 10 gigabytes of memory per AWS Lambda. So again, that kind of just reinforces the idea of these are supposed to be small, quick things that you're doing. And you might ask, well, how can that really be useful? Well, there's all sorts of use cases. People build amazing tools and data pipelines all built around AWS Lambda. If you think about stuff that you run on an Airflow worker, right? Many people are very familiar with Apache Airflow, and you're running tasks. It could be small things, small little bash files, copying files around, doing things. I'm guessing a lot of that stuff that runs on Airflow most likely could run on an AWS Lambda if you're talking about small bits of Python code or bash files that maybe you're moving some files around, doing some minor file manipulation, things like that. A lot of that work can probably be done on an AWS Lambda, and it's cheap and scalable. Another cool thing about AWS Lambdas is how you trigger them. That's another important concept, is how does Lambda actually trigger? Well, obviously you can just trigger it yourself by, say, doing a command line thing, trigger this Lambda. But in the AWS world, there's all sorts of way a Lambda can kick off. It can kick off based on a file hitting a bucket in S3. Say like every time a file is created in S3, you can automatically kick off a Lambda. That's super useful in a data engineering context. In fact, I have many Lambdas I've written myself running in production that are based around that. Some file comes into S3, some small CSV or flat file, and you have to do, maybe it's like tab to conversion to CSV file, or, changing headers, or just doing some file manipulation. That's perfect for Lambdas, right? So yeah, there's lots of, you can even do time-based triggers, right? Like a Lambda that kicks off at a certain time. That's very useful for running small little things. Another important concept of a Lambda is the context. So any Lambda that's triggered or run has some sort of context that's being passed into it. And that context, again, in the case of an S3 file, it could be, what is the name of the S3 file? Where's it located at, right? So the context of a Lambda is important. We'll see that later. Next, what we're going to do is just give a quick look at an AWS Lambda in the real world. We're going to be in my AWS account. So if you have a AWS account, you're not your own, you should get one. You can just make one for free. You don't have to worry about spending money. A lot of the stuff up front is pretty free. Obviously, I don't have any Lambda functions here, but we definitely can make one. And how would you go about making a Lambda? So if I click create function, it kind of gives me some options, right? You see options about, we can make them from scratch, use a blueprint, container image. I kind of go with the container image one. Obviously, it's got runtimes. So AWS provides different runtimes, Python, Node, right? All kind of stuff like that, right? Python, Go, Java, Node. I'm going to kind of show you guys how to do it using Docker, using a container, and kind of talk about what it looks like to do it that way. I just think Docker images are a great way to do stuff, especially Lambdas. So what does a Lambda actually look like if we want to look at some Lambda code? I have some code I'd worked on not too long ago. And basically what a Lambda looks like is basically any code. It could be Python, could be anything else. But it always has an entry point. In the case, I think the default is Lambda handler. Your Lambda code you write has to have an entry point. And that entry point by default is Lambda handler. That means when this Python code that I write, when it runs, automatically it's going to look for a function named Lambda handler and call it. And basically you put whatever you want inside, whatever it could be. The code could be anything. In my case, I'm obviously reading some files from S3. I'm reading them into a data frame using the polars library. And then doing some stuff with it, right? I'm running some SQL on it and then writing the file back out to S3. So that's, really straightforward, right? A very common data engineering thing. Read some file, do some data frame manipulation, some SQL, write it back out. Perfect for a Lambda. That's not really important what's happening inside the Lambda as much as what the Lambda looks like itself. And of course, we would have a Docker file since I told you we're going to use images. The Docker file, basically they being AWS provides some images, base images, AWS does. And they obviously have a Python image. So when I just build my own Docker file, I say here's my Docker image. I want to use the Python one, then I can just install my extra requirements that I want and copy my code in. All right, I just want Bodo, S3, Pyro, polars, whatever your code is doing. And the command, obviously it's calling my Lambda handler function. Pretty easy. But that doesn't really tell you how to deploy it, right? So what if I actually wanted to deploy it? Well, if I want to do a container or a Docker image in AWS, I would actually have to first make a registry, Elastic Container Registry, where my Docker image would be stored. So I'm going to make a private one and call it Confessions. I'm going to create it. There it is. There's my container registry. Now, at that point, I should be able to build a Docker image and push it out there easily enough. I mean, I've already done this project in the past. Kind of some things to know about, if you're going to deploy Lambdas like this and you're thinking in a CI/CD context. Obviously, we would have to build the image, which I've already got this image because I've built it. It's there. I've already got this image available to myself. Probably be able to see it somewhere. I've got a million images, confessions. You can see confessions images. We're actually going to deploy this into production. What would you do? Well, first you'd have to build your Docker image and push it out to your Amazon registry. What would that look like? When I did this project before, I put a few different instructions in there. So basically we would have to authenticate. That's what I'm going to do here. My command line was going to authenticate with my AWS CLI and my Docker, get the login, boom, I'm logged in. All right, and then of course I would have built my image. We can do it again, but I've already got a Docker image built, so obviously you'd have your Docker image. You would change directory into wherever your Docker image is in your code. In my case, polars, yep. And then I would just say, hey, build this thing. It's gonna go ahead and build my Docker image and run through everything. Think. You can see it thinking hard and building. And then once it's done, we're going to tag that image and then we'll push it out to our container registry. And again, this is how we are going to manage the AWS Lambda. So if you were in a data engineering team and you could put some CI/CD around this, right? If we have a repository sitting in GitHub, we could obviously put some CI/CD in this. When somebody makes a code change, we could go ahead and kick off something that built a new image and pushed it out into the ECR, right? We could do all this automatically, which is important to do the CI/CD part automatically. Obviously, we're doing it here in a manual step, but you're kind of getting an idea of how it looks to work on an AWS Lambda as a data engineer. At this point, our image is now being pushed out to our ECR repository in AWS, at which point then we can finally go ahead and set up our Lambda. And you might be wondering, so what does an AWS Lambda have to do with ECR and Docker containers, things like that? Well, that's just how it works, right? At AWS, Lambda is just a small little piece of code that's running, and of course Docker is a great way to encapsulate that code and push it up, right? Because they're not giving you necessarily something to run. You have to write the code that's going to run, so most of this work is on your side as a developer to come up with the code, build a Docker image, put it out there somewhere where AWS can see it, and then we can attach it to a Lambda and make our Lambda work. Now that it's pushed out there, we should be able to go back to our repository, and of course there we have our image that we just pushed out just now. It's great. At that point, we should be able to go back to a Lambda. We go ahead here and say we're going to create a new function. We're going to use a container image. We're going to call it Polars Lambda, because that's what it is. It's a Polars Lambda. And then we're going to go get the repository and the image that we're using. Of course, you have to think about this. With AWS, of course, you can't get away from all the roles and IAM and permissions. Of course, you may need to create a new role or attach some, depending on what your Lambda function is doing, it may need permission to do such things, right? You'll have to take care of that yourself. Obviously, if the Lambda's reading and writing from S3, it needs to have permissions to do that. And we wait for our function to create. And honestly, that's really all there is to creating a function. Once that function is created, you have the ability to trigger it. Once it's there, basically you can create a trigger on it through the UI. You can I could trigger it from the command line by simply running this. I could attach a schedule to it, maybe put a trigger on it for S3, and that's basically a Lambda function. So again, what do data engineers need about Lambda functions? They're supposed to be quick and small, 15 minutes max, 10 gigabytes max of memory. So obviously it's got to be working on smaller data. You got to think about how you want to trigger that Lambda. Is it going to be a manual trigger where you have something run a command line and kick it off? Do you put a schedule on it? Is it triggered on an S3 file? Right? You're in charge of writing all the code inside your Lambda handler function. It could be anything. You can pick a Python, Go, whatever language you want, Java, write your code. Pay attention to the context that's coming into the Lambda handler. In this instance, I'm not using the context, but say you're triggering off an S3 file, of course you could. Once your code's written, the best way, personally, I think, to deploy a Lambda is simply to use one of the provided Docker images from AWS, kind of copy on your own, layer on your own requirements, and then basically build and deploy that Docker image out to ECR, at which point you can attach it to the Lambda, and then Lambda can run. So what does that mean at a high level? That's an interesting question. I think that AWS Lambdas are not used as much as they should be from data engineering. I think it's a great tool because it's serverless. It scales well. I think there is use cases for it. It could probably reduce costs for things that run on, say, Airflow, for example. A lot of those are smaller type jobs running Bash scripts or Python scripts. Could possibly migrate those to an AWS Lambda. I would think overall it does require a little bit more dev time, right? You do have to understand a command line. You've got to understand Docker a little bit. And to do it in a productionized manner, you'd probably have to kind of automate some of the building process of images and the code, when new code is pushed up. So there's a little bit more DevOps there, but I think in the long run, it probably drives you to be a better engineer. Possibly you learn a little bit more. So that's kind of what it looks like to create and manage Lambda. So obviously very high level, didn't get into the details, but I think if you're not familiar with Lambdas, I think that kind of gives you a very high level of kind of what you're getting yourself into.